Good morning, Dr. R. Michael Fisher. I want to talk about the issue and tension I'm seeing growing that is becoming tensional conflict to battle of survival in terms of how conflict is being produced and is exacerbated now in this post-November 5th, 2024 election and the new regime in the United States as presidential candidates that all got in and or the crew that's joined President Trump, and what's turning out to be this interesting confrontation and reckoning with the left, the new left, the progressives. I see myself within that progressive camp, and at the same time as I'm watching the progressive camp trying to cope with, trying to understand, trying to fight back, trying to resist this Trumpocracy, what I'm noticing is that I am less and less keen on the left, the new left, the progressives. My people, my side is becoming less and less interesting, and it's becoming more and more flawed. What do I mean by that? It's just, to me, it's just not growing up in the sense that it's not maturing. So, topic of today, probably a first short video, and it will be a series, I think. It's so important to me. The issue of cultural sovereignty versus cultural maturity. And I'm particularly going to be focusing on this perspective of cultural maturity. I'm using this book, but many other theorists and thinkers, which some I'll mention as I go through these videos. This one, particularly by Charles Johnston, who's now the late Charles Johnston, a psychiatrist, artist, and futurist in America that I've followed since the 1980s, off and on. And so, critic also of his work, but also I think he's got great ideas about why a futurist perspective is so important to the notion of culture and the cultural domain. So I sort of see, just basically my theory is there's a natural domain, there's a cultural domain, and there's a spiritual domain. So that's what I call an integral or triadic model of the cosmos, of my understanding of relationship in the cosmos. So we're going to focus on the cultural because that's where all the most intense conflicts are in terms of one culture's worldview attacking another and their values, their beliefs. We got the left versus the right, got the progressives versus the conservatives, the liberals versus the um, Republicans, whatever it might be. So all of those, are real, and they're real across many dimensions of our world. And I'll just call it at times just the leftist position, in general, as a way to describe what I'm referring to as this progressive, more liberal, more future oriented, more individual freedom oriented, et cetera, et cetera. However, all of those tendencies can be turned pathological. So the left can go pathological, the right, and their values can go pathological. So I'm a cultural psychiatrist, quote, psychiatrist, a feariatrist, which I've talked about in other videos. That's really what I love to do, is cultural feariatry or fear analysis. So getting away from fear for a moment, not talking about that specifically, I'm going to focus on cultural sovereignty and cultural maturity. Two stories, very brief, that will help bring you in to where I'm going today. Thanks for sticking in with me if you can, because this is such a good conversation. I would love to hear your views in the comments so we can have some dialogue exploring this. So, the two stories, the first one will be that on the news just the other night out of Idaho in the United States, there was a teacher being interviewed by one of the local stations. And they're being interviewed because the teacher obviously went to the press because they had an issue, this teacher, with the school, their principal, and then the school board, because the teacher was challenging this principal's view, which was to take down a poster in her classroom, grade 6 classroom. She teaches apparently social studies, civics, education, has been for several years successfully. And this teacher, young woman in her 20s, is now being told, take these posters down. There was a couple of them, and I'll just share the one idea. And it was a poster that said, everyone is welcome. And this is what the teacher wanted for the atmosphere of the class. It was similar to somewhat, although modified, compared to a poster that the school itself and the principal supported, which was, all about welcoming and inviting, and people are welcome. So this teacher just put up one, and it happened to have all different hands of different colors going all the way from white to the darkest black, and put a heart on each of the hands. It was a little cartoon painting. So obviously interested that this teacher wanted to go just a little step further than people are welcome to the school. And this poster said, everyone is welcome, exclamation mark, in huge letters, and had been up in the classroom for years. And nobody complained. But now we're in a post-November 5th Trumpian world, and there's an attack, an anti-wokeism, is another way to put it, an anti-progressive attack, reinforced and reinvigorated hugely by that American government right now. And it is attacking this teacher, and basically is threatening that that teacher will probably lose their job if they do not take those posters down. That's a longer fight. I'll put a link to that short little clip story so you can actually see the story itself and hear some of the interview. Obviously, teachers and students are even already starting to rally around this teacher, saying they have a right to put up this poster. They're just expressing what would be universal human values. And the school board is arguing, no, you're promoting your personal opinion that everyone is welcome across that color range. And of course, it could have been across gender range, whatever the poster could have been for a leftist cultural positioning of a progressive society, right? A progressive culture. So that's why culture is going to be important today. And I'm going, okay, so is that sign that that teacher put up, is it culturally mature? Or is it taking us on a direction of a cultural maturity, a cultural maturation process, a cultural development, right? A cultural evolutionary direction. That's what I'm interested in. And if you're not interested in that, you probably won't watch this video much longer, because most people, and this is on the right and the left by far, are more interested today in cultural sovereignty, not cultural maturation. So I come in as a futurist, an educator, evolutionary thinker, philosopher to this topic. Okay, so let's define a few things. Cultural maturity would be basically where, and this is what I'm promoting, right? And the futurist in me, the thinker in me. And whether it's on the right or the left is not so important. I just want to know that people are interested in cultural maturity as a concept. Well, what does that mean? Well, we could look at different cultural theories. The book I just showed you by Charles Johnston, he's basically saying there are principles that we can bring from the natural sciences all the way to social sciences to the philosophical and theological fields of disciplines, and we could find principles that would articulate a maturity. This would be sometimes called a vertical line of development compared to just horizontal line of development of diversity, but with a vertical intention, knowing that there's some diverse views that are more inclusive, more transcendent, and more arguably ethical. And this is part of a consciousness theory of evolution. Other theories could be brought into this. I won't go into those in this video. Cultural maturity is basically saying that no matter what your cultural identification is with, and that could be by gender, sex, age, color, ethnic background, geography, your historical autobiography belonging to a particular bloodline or interest group, ideology group, religion, cultural background, right? These are all part of cultural identification. So I just threw a whole slew of those into cultural identification. And when the human self, gets connected to that identity of the cultural norms, right? The cultural privileging, when it gets really identified with that, and then you meet somebody who's identified with a cultural norm, cultural identity that is not the same as yours. So this would be like Jewish versus Christian, for example. Could be black versus white. It could be progressive versus traditional. Then you get what's called the culture wars. So I started studying culture wars back in the early 90s, and I was very interested and still interested in its various variations and its new morphing these days. So there's woke culture and anti-woke culture is another, these polar opposites coming together. So remember I said today is all about conflict. It's about relationships and it's about international relationships, which is my second story. Okay, so cultural maturity, I'm arguing, is a theoretical and potentially very real trajectory that us as human citizens, educators particularly, would be interested in, is to advance the cultural maturation to these higher principles, as I say, that could be collected from all traditions and just pick out, basically what are the highest and the most valuable moral, ethical principles for the good life, the common good life for everyone, ideally. Cultural sovereignty is going to cover now through the second story, and I will try to define it. This is kind of new thinking for me, brand new, thinking of this juxtaposition, cultural sovereignty versus cultural maturity. Now, I think they can go together, so that would be my final argument. Doesn't have to be one or the other, it can be both and. But right now, they're in a huge battle. So let's go to the cultural sovereignty understanding. And that to me comes through the recent story of watching President Trump announcing that he thinks Canada, where I live, my home, born and raised, their northern neighbor, their most closest ally and long-term 80-year plus trading partner, have now turned into a economic war, as you know, with tariffs being implanted by Trump of 25% plus on many things, and the Canadians responding with this exaggeration again of inflated, well, if you do that to us, we're going to do this to you, and slap tariffs back on you. So now we're on a border war, a tariff war, an economic war, and it's a sovereignty war. As soon as Donald Trump added to his agenda, not just tariffs, he added that I really am interested in, basically putting you folks on your knees so that you come in and join us as a 51st state of America. We'll welcome you. Just as Trump has now changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America on his own terms. So these are legal and illegal moves by Trump, no doubt. That all will be sorted out in history. That's not what I'm going to go into today, but let's talk about what's actually going on is the culture wars. And the culture war is that, are you a Canadian or are you American? If you're a Canadian, do you want to be American? Do you want to transform? Do you want to transition to? Do you want to join the bigger unity of this mono monster that is south of us, our friend, so called, but also now is threatening us? Basically, because they're 10 times, everything Canada has, they have 10 times as much, except really good natural clean resources like us and water and minerals that the Americans need and are running out of. So really, literally, Trump is just asking, would you help us with some really important, crucial things like water, fresh water, etc. But he's coming in with, the dominator, Machiavellian leadership style, which is to bully, intimidate, knock him down, and then take them over when they're weak. Well, Canadians are not going to just take that, but it's hard to say how long we can actually fight and double down. So now Canada is becoming very sovereign, pride, more so than they were. I've always had some, but when you're under attack from another nation, right, another sovereign country, America, um, that they want to annex you, basically, yeah, it really builds your in group, right, versus out group now is really increased. So even the conservative culture wars versus the liberal cultures in Canada, those positions, those ideologies, those parties politically in provinces across the huge country we are, they are now, of course, uniting, even with their differences, because they an economic tariff tax and the attempt to make us a 51st state affects every Canadian, no matter what position you're at. So it's like we took it to another level. Trump took it to another level, which I think is actually a good thing at some level for sure. It's got horrible consequences, tragic, actually. And that will be something that we're going to have to grieve and, go through compassionately as I can. But without getting into all the details of the constructivity and the destructivity of those moves being made by this leadership in the United States. And then the counter moves is what I'm talking about. So what we're seeing in the counter moves is Canadians, instead of saying, oh, that's interesting, Mr. Trump, we should have some conversations about that 51st state idea. No, it's absolute zero on the agenda for Canadians, at least the Canadian leaders that are speaking up, and I'm certainly, no doubt, the majority of Canadians. So I'm one of the ones that would say, "Oh, okay, well, tell us about that deal. How would that look? And how are you inviting us into the co-construction of that to transform our nation, which is fine if you want to add that as a 51st state. I want to know how that transforms your nation in the process of co-transforming with each other." Oh, well, that's not on Donald Trump's agenda. So, to be clear, that's exactly what's happening. It is a one-way join us or we'll screw you. We can do it nicely if you join us. We can do it nastily and you'll join us. Well, that's not a transformational conflict model, which is what I've studied, which I think is the most advanced, progressive, most liberal in that sense, leftist of the conflict theories. And other conflict theories obviously do not operate on that higher consciousness of co-transformation, co-creation of a deal, of a solution to a conflict, to a difference. So on the news I just watched this morning, our Canadian Foreign Minister of Economic Affairs got on and is down in the United States having negotiations with Rubio down there, the Americans' side of this economic tariff 51st state issues. And she says, the Canadian, well, basically, we don't just have a difference of opinion. We don't just have different countries. And what's going on with tax and tariffs is not just about our differences. She says there's something that trumps the idea of just having differences, is that we are in battle. And she said, we're in battle for our sovereignty. So as long as you keep that on the table, she's saying to American government, the idea of Canada as a 51st state in your future plans, anything we negotiate on the table is not a negotiation anymore. It's a battle. We're at war. And it's yet to be seen how far that war will go, how vicious it will get, how military it will get, how economic it will get, political, etc. And it's shaking up the world because the world's watching what's going on with this gigantic country, 10 times bigger than Canada in terms of population, forces, power, economically, and so on, military. What is it going to do to Canada? Is it going to squash it, invade it? This is going to be Russia, Ukraine on a different scale, but same idea. Israel, Gaza. See, this is the kind of conflict, tension, and people are really triggered right now. And they're triggered on both sides. Those who want to dominate, those who feel victimized, wanting to double down on their sovereignty. So what's not happening in Canada or many of these other nations that feel victimized by the big bullies, the Goliaths of the world, what's happening is they're not knowing how, it seems, or finding the direction to say, well, we're interested in a transformational conflict resolution process between you and us. And here's what it would look like. And as I said, that could be discussed in a whole other video. What is transformational conflict as a theory, as a practice, and how it's worked and perhaps not worked, and how most people don't even know about it. They just think you got to barter back and forth and give and yield, give and take, as they say, and then eventually, hopefully, you can resolve a conflict. But Canada is saying, from a sovereignty point of view, no. As long as that's on the table, that you want to erase Canada's identity culturally as we've known ourselves as Canadians, quote, and that's a big umbrella. So we're very diverse within that culture, with many cultures and subcultures, if you will, right down to identities, right? Of gender, sexuality, of color, of class, distinctions. But those are part of my culture. That's my culture. That's where I belong. That's my tribe. That's my group. That's my religion, etc. So what we're getting now, and we're getting that in the school teacher example story I just shared, is that this teacher is saying, I'm not going to take that poster down because that is the sovereignty of a teacher in their classroom, is to promote universal values of care, that all children are welcome. I mean, this poster even says everyone is welcome, which, of course, unfortunately, is actually not true. Everyone is not welcome. If you're a terrorist, you're not welcome in that school or classroom. So we can go into fine details and tear that apart. That's the problem with this leftist. As I said, that's my critique. The left still is arguing in ways that are still very old school. They're not very futurist, creative, because they do not have an idea of cultural maturity. What they have is an idea of is cultural sovereignty. And so that school teacher is trying to produce and reproduce a cultural sovereignty of the classroom and the teacher in that classroom, but we could call it a classroom culture of a progressive, liberal, inclusive, diversity and inclusivity, DEI kind of ideology. That all sounds good if you're on the left. Now starting to sound horrible if you're on the right, and they're attacking it and taking it down. Trump is systematically going through and taking it out of education. And he'll be taking it out of every kind of organization that exists, including all the care fields. And that's what I care about. All the caregivers who have these left progressive values of care and inclusivity with diversity and unity and peace and harmony, right? It goes back to the ecological movements, goes back to the peace movements, all things that I've watched on the left, these various movements and streams, feminist movement, and so on. indigenous decolonizing, and so on. These are going to be systematically undermined and erased. That's the goal, Trumpocracy, which is a right movement. It's coming from the right. So the left is trying to double down, first of all, to get their claim their sovereignty. Canada's doing the same thing. They're trying to double down and save their sovereignty. So it's very much a savior survival patterning in both those two cases I just gave, and you could think of many more, perhaps. I could. And I'm saying that survivalism doubling down. I've seen it in liberal progressive groups like Democracy and Belonging Group out of Berkeley University. They're doing the same thing since the Trump, you know, was elected in that new regime, and because they're trying to support all the trans and color and gender and race. They're anti-discrimination oriented groups like that all over the place. And that's what I see them all doing. And I don't see any new theorizing. I don't see this open thinking, as I said. Even if Trump says we want to be the 51st state, I would say, as a Canadian and a leader in Canada, if I was a leader officially recognized, I would say, okay, well, tell me about that, and let's put that into a transformational, evolutionary developmental model, a futurist model of where are we going? How is this going to evolve human societies? Bring cultural maturity so that we can mature our cultures and mature the entire cultural sphere of everything that comes under the umbrella of cultural. Again, I won't talk about the natural world here and the spiritual world. They are related to the cultural, but today I'm just focusing on the cultural, but they're kind of like a Venn diagram, those three realms for me. So that would be a much higher level critical integral meta theory thinking about cultural. But to get away from that and not get it too complex, let's just keep it at this cultural sovereignty and cultural maturity. Okay, so what we need, here's my recommendation as I finish here for today, is we need to start thinking, reading books like Charles Johnston, and talking and having conversations and educating ourselves and rethinking what would it mean that there's such a concept even of cultural maturity. And obviously the process of cultural maturation to get to whatever that arbitrary maturity actually is, even though I know the theorists I'm looking at, it's endless in its maturation. But there is a maturation to it, just as there's a maturation from being born as a zygote in the mother to becoming a child, to becoming an adolescent, to becoming an adult, to becoming what I call a post-adult, and onward. And what kind of thinking, right? What kind of values, what kind of identities of the self? Well, it's going to be different along that different growth, that spiral of growth. As I said, even a vertical growth, just horizontal to a maturation, not just differences. But as long as we're caught in X versus Y, dominator versus the oppressed, predator versus the prey, the big bully against, the victim. As long as we're caught in that, and that's where the left is caught, the leftist imaginary right now is really stuck, as I see it, and it's not creative for the most part. I don't hear it. I would love to hear it. Bring on the conversations. I'm waiting for it. I don't see it on these websites of the NGOs and the theorizing. I see them doubling down, trying to create cultural sovereignty. And they'll do that through all the various identities, right? Color, gender, age, race, sexuality, and so on. Class. Even Bernie Sanders with his class attack, which is great that he's doing what he's doing in the United States as an independent. But he's still completely protecting, in a survivalist mode, the cultural sovereignty, class sovereignty. And he doesn't have a progressive futurist model, in my view. he's stuck to in leftist ideology imaginaries. And he's trying to integrate that into the mainstream culture, which is a good idea. A lot of people want it. They like the sound of it. He's gaining a lot of popularity now. But I don't look for him as a futurist thinker at all. I would like him to be open to it as well as the work he's doing. And so there's my conclusion. Do the cultural sovereignty work, folks, mostly to leftists, do that, and then do the cultural maturity work as well, and research and thinking. Bring them both together. And if this video kickstarts that conversation, I'll be very happy. And I'll be glad to join in on that movement. Because the other movements, I'm not really interested in survivalist, doubling down, cultural sovereignty type of agendas. They are only going to produce more and more polarization as they try to retract and double down and to protect themselves. Even though I totally understand why you would protect yourself. There's a real fear, yes. But we got to really take that fear management to a higher level along this path of fearlessness, which is the core of my work and my fearlessness theory, which I have on all my other videos and other places I've written works that you can look up on Google Scholar or wherever you want. So thanks for today. Look forward to our next conversations.